Thank you so much, Anika. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation to present at your colloquium. Hello, Torsten. Hello, everyone that I see here, that I recognize the name still. How are you doing? It's very nice being here and having this time to share with you a little bit um, of what I intend to present as a provocation to think about the universality of digital history as a field and as a concept from a Latin American perspective. And it's important to be clear that it's from a Latin American perspective because I'm here from Brazil and I'm a Latin American. This doesn't mean that this is the perspective from Latin America. I don't have the intention of speaking for everyone and considering other levels of diversity that we have around here, of course. And the way that I would try to manage this presentation is, and this lecture is somehow to split between these theoretical provocations and a little bit of an ongoing research project that involves mapping and understanding a field that is in general very uneven, so to speak. So what I will try to do is to, especially in this beginning, try to explain how I want to proceed in the next few minutes so that it's understandable for everyone where I'm coming from and where I intend to be. So digital history, we all speak about digital history. We all here, I think, to some extent have some connection with digital history as a research area, specifically in modern historiography. And of course, as every term that we deal with and every concept that we deal with, we intend to think that there is a minimal understanding that is collectively shared between all of us of what digital history is. And this is what allows, for example, a day-to-day AI service like the one from Google to answer you what is digital history, and it provides you an answer very quickly. And this answer, it's rather, in a way, monological in the sense that it's an answer that starts somewhere and ends here, and it's not a long answer, and it can somehow provide some characteristics of digital history overall. And the assumption behind this type of answer that any AI service could provide us regarding digital history or any type of specific research area, and it has somehow a rhetorics of universality, of an intention that people from wherever they are, they can read this definition of digital history and they can understand a field that has this idea of globality in it, of universality in it, of ubiquity in it, so to speak. And my question is, okay, I've been reading about digital history and working with this field for a while now, as most of you are too. And my question is there something that we could call a Latin American, or in my case, more specifically, Brazilian digital history? Is there a German digital history in opposition to other types of national digital histories? Does it make sense to think about nations in this sense? Does it make sense to think about regions in the world in this sense? Or we can definitely speak about digital history, only digital history in a universal sense that somehow intercrosses different areas and parts of the world? So I have these two questions, and the clues that I have to think about these questions and to question about a potential specificity of digital history in the case of Latin America comes from visible inequalities and from personal observations of someone that is coming from here and working here day to day in Brazil, but also I have the luck of being someone that also have friends and somehow passed by DH labs in other parts of the world, in the US, in Europe as well. And something that I can see for sure is that there are visible inequalities in these fields and in the way that we can create conditions and infrastructures to produce digital history. So, for example, I bring here just as an example a picture of the, I don't know if we can call this the living room of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, which looks super nice with nice couches and nice organization and space. And below it's the small office and room that I'm trying to build DH lab, a digital history lab on my university. And this is a picture that was taken like this week. So I don't want to this would say, oh my God, this is so precarious and it's so bad. No, this is great. It's a nice room. We have two computers and there's lots of space that we can do nice stuff. But for me, it's noticeable that it's a space that lacks space. We don't have a living room. And the process of building everything, it's a process that depends on the voluntary action of myself and other colleagues. So for example, all the problems, you have a long process of trying to solve the problems, to make a computer work, or to have keyboards, or to buy a cable for the internet and stuff like this. This all relies and depends a lot on the people taking care of the lab. And this is a situation that it's already very privileged, so to speak, because there's a lot of labs that I know that I don't have a proper room or computers or stuff like this. So these are the clues that makes me think, okay, we're dealing with a field that so often talks about innovation, interdisciplinarity, and historians trying to get a sense of fields that are not their own fields initially. If you think about the idea of computation and coding and stuff like this, how do we deal with this if we're talking about the conditions and people that are working in these fields from the margins? And the provocations is basically, how do we produce, and we think about the knowledge in digital history and digital humanities in general, from a condition of a periphery? So if you are in an economic or in a infrastructural periphery of the world, without being stuck in the idea of producing a marginalized idea of history, or a marginalized type of knowledge. My idea is that can we think about plural digital histories in the sense that people that are in more precarious condition don't feel that they're just behind, and every time looking ahead and looking at the global north and thinking, oh, I need to be there, I'm not there. How do we think about an idea of differentiality? And how do we deal with inequality in a field that demands so much in terms of infrastructure and in terms of creating a methodological heavy approach that involves historians getting in touch, for example, with IT specialists or stuff like this? Well, how do I think about try to investigate this? How do we even make a question like this? There are multiple pathways. We could, for example, analyze the production and the things that historians have written about digital history in Latin America versus what they've written, for example, in Europe or in North America. We could analyze the curriculum or the syllabuses of courses in digital history and how they think and how they figure the idea of teaching about these topics. What I decided to do, and I will explain this decision a little bit later, is firstly, I tried to combine an ethnography of the field in Latin America, focusing on the digital history or digital humanities labs in general. So I tried to understand how these labs work and characterize them in a transnational manner. And I want to somehow bring a theoretical reflection that talks about the history of this tension about universality and particularity in the case of Latin American history, specifically in the case of the history of history in Latin America. So the history of the modern discipline of history, and how have historians in the past, since the 19th century, have dealt with the idea that they were producing a type of knowledge that was originally created and developed, for example, in the methodic circles of historicism in Germany or the methodical school in France or things like this. So I'll try to combine this empirical work of ethnography with a theoretical and conceptual reflection on the history of the production of knowledge in history and in the humanities in general in the region. And this is more or less how I'll try to organize this presentation here. So firstly, I'll focus on this ethnography and try to explain the process of mapping the unmapped, or trying to understand how these labs are working. Why did I decide to work with digital history labs specifically as a pathway to understand the field overall? Well, firstly, because I was always very intrigued by the idea of a laboratorial turn in the humanities that was brought by multiple authors, but also from Ursula Pavlika-Degger. And the idea specifically that for digital history and digital humanities, the very idea of how common it is for us to talk about the DH lab as something that is more or less universal and very, very often reproduces the same name, digital history lab or digital humanities lab, or variations of the same words, whatever you are, this brings the idea that these spaces, they're important. They're important because usually the entrance of the debates about the implications of digital transformation, the possibilities, the positive and negative possibilities that this brings for the production of knowledge in the humanities, this comes somehow around these labs. These are the places where you have people that combine the skill of being historians, but also, I don't know, coding in Python or stuff like this. These are the places where you have the infrastructures and the computers that allow people and historians to process the research data in scale, for example. These are the places where you have conditions for producing, for example, podcasts or video focusing on public goals for history and other types of areas in the humanities. So the idea is that the laboratories are super important for the development of digital history since the early 21st century. And my observation is that maybe the conditions and the types of labs that you have emerging and that one has emerging in Latin America, they might not achieve the standards of infrastructure and organization and institutionalization that is the same one that the greatest labs, such as the Rosenzweig centers, yourself there in the Humboldt-University, or the one that I'm still part of the IAG in Mainz have. So I try to somehow create a strategy to understand how these labs are. These two pictures that I show here, for example, they illustrate a little bit of this, because the one behind is a lab in Argentina that you have a very nice website and you can see lots of information about them. But the other one is just an announcement of a lab, Historia Digital, so a digital history lab from Chile. And this is an announcement that they're making a workshop to launch this lab. But I don't know anything else about this lab. There's no website. There's no social media page. I know that this lab exists. I think that it exists because it's announced that there is a workshop about the lab. But I have no idea who they are, what they're doing, if they have infrastructure or not. So my idea was, okay, I'm going to start by an active search and try to somehow gather information about these labs and create categories to somehow build a database of labs. And then I'll try to combine this with an online survey so that I can understand how they work and the place of digital history in this digital humanities lab. So this is an ongoing project. It was already an ongoing project last year when I presented a previous version of this in this panel that I participated with Thorsten and Till in the DH25 in Lisbon. And now this is a 2.0 version, and it's still ongoing. So the 15 categories that I wanted to know, they're all very basic, like where these labs are, when were they founded, do they have physical space, how many members do they have, what are these disciplines that they have, what do they do they have resources in terms of infrastructure, what do they have, how does it work in terms of funding, do they have specific funding or not, are they doing collaborative work nationally or internationally? So I did this surveys in Portuguese and Spanish. And right now, what I have is a map of 36 labs identified in Latin America. I have just a first call of the survey out, and I got only 12 answers. So 1/3 of the labs answered my calls and gave me more specific information. Of course, this is just the first call, so I'll try to gather more information and I expect to get more information. And things in general that I want to punctuate before presenting specific results from this observation, this ethnographic outlook. There's a lot of what we can call somehow ghost labs, in the sense that they exist because there's information about them somewhere, like the one that I just presented about the workshop. But I don't know exactly where they are, what's the institution that are managing them, what they're doing. I have basically no information about them. This is a huge problem because you have an announcement, a public announcement of a lab, and you have an indication that you have a manifestation of digital history somewhere, but you can't find information about it. And the other problem is that you have whole countries that I could not find a digital lab using the active search on tools like Google or other types of web search tools. And this is also an odd thing, because I'm pretty sure that there are people in multiple countries in Latin America that are working and have historians working in digital history, but it's interesting that I could not find a proper lab, or if I found a lab, I could not put this lab on a map because I could not find out where exactly they are in the country. So this gives me a very an indication in the beginning that this phenomenon that, from what I know so far, most of the labs started more or less, the average date is 2018. So this is as expected, a phenomenon from the mid 2010s. And it's complicated and indicates that somehow my indication and my perception, my hypothesis, that there's this level of precarity that somehow gets in the way of the thinking about the field and integrating the field in a global sense. This might be true to some extent, because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unknowns in my data set. If you do a very basic math, you have an average of 22% of unknown information per category, which is a lot. It's almost a quarter of the information that I wanted. I don't have this information. Of course, with the surveys that people are answering, I'm getting lots of this unknown information solved, and I'm having real information over it. So the database is getting richer and richer. However, one problem is that if you have a lab that only exists because of a news announcing its existence, or they have a very static website with an institutional email and no name of people that are actually part of this lab, it's very often that I send this lab an email and they basically never answer, because the indication is that this email exists, but it's not used for real. So this shows already this disparity in terms of information and numbers. This continues if you look at for example, the number of members of the labs. You have from labs that say that they have only 2 people working on it. So they're a lab of 2, which is very interesting to see, because it seems more like a partnership than a lab if you think about it. But you have people saying, no, we have only 2 people, we're 3, we're 4 people. And you see here in this chart that it's not many, not that few. Lots of labs, they basically rely on the work of 1, 2, 3, or 4 people. And other labs, on the other hand, they have the names of, in the list of members in the websites, or basically answering the service, they have 40 people attached to the lab, which indicate that you might be thinking about a gigantic lab with lots of people in a very vivid research life, which of course might be true. And in some senses it is true. But on the other hand, if we look at the profile of the people working in the lab, and I'll show this quickly to you, you see that lots of people, they are attached to the lab, but this doesn't mean that they're part of the lab in terms of having a proper job or a proper salary attached to it, or a grant or something like this, or scholarship or something like this. You have lots of people that are somehow attached to the lab just because they share a common interest, but this doesn't mean that they're actually doing this type of work. Regarding the physical space, I have few answers, as I could say so far. Most of the labs, they do have a physical space from what I see so far. However, some of them, 3 of the 14 that I got answers to, they don't have a physical space. So they're a lab that exists as a joint of practices and people doing their research in their own spaces, and it doesn't have a proper space with infrastructure for people to have a meeting, for example, or an encounter in presence. They're completely online fashions. Regarding the disciplines, the profile of the people involved, as I told you, it's noticeable that lots of these labs, they're attached to professors and people that are somehow leading these labs, which I think is fairly common, not only in Latin America, but everywhere. But it's interesting to see that the second most present profile of researchers in these labs are students without scholarship, which tells me that they're basically the students from these professors, that they're not automatically, but they're attached to the lab because of the professors. And this shows that somehow you have you might have in a case or in another case an inflated number of people in labs. Some of the, of course, they're part of the lab, but they're not people working in research as master students or doctorate students. They're also there, but you have lots of students. They're basically students from these professors that get somehow an almost automated integration to these labs. Regarding the disciplines, what I could see so far is that history is very, very important from the disciplines of the members of these labs that have been mapping so far. So history is the majority discipline that we can see, but we also have some other disciplines involved and lots of disciplines towards the humanities. So there's some diversity there as well. Regarding the activities, most of these labs, as I kind of expected, they fulfill a role of research and more than teaching in regular courses, training for the use of digital tools. So most of these labs that are marked here as training, they're talking about training for using Zotero or using Tropy or basic, coding skills and computational literacy 101, stuff like this. So it's not really that these labs, they fulfill an important role in here. This is confirms an indication that I think we all share to some extent about the nature of the digital history and digital humanities labs in general, that they fulfill this idea of bringing these debates to departments and programs and somehow teaching in the way they can how to manage with the novelty, so to speak, of digital tools. What else we have? Okay, about the infrastructure. This is interesting because this shows, for example, that there's most of the labs, they have a combined use of institutional infrastructure with personal computers. Lots of labs, they only have the personal computers, so they're basically working on their own and they don't have the infrastructures provided by the university or the institution that aggregate the lab. It's very noticeable. The big tech companies in terms of cloud services and AI tools that are very present in most of the labs. Most of the labs, including myself here, they're attached to, for example, a contract that the university had with Google, and everything is about Google, and you have basically a digital world that is managed by one company. In other cases, it's Microsoft. But anyway, this shows this presence, although we cannot say that that is inexistent, the use of open source and open access tools and somehow things that connects with a more critical view in terms of digital sovereignty and against the dependency of proprietary platforms. So this is also noticeable when we look about the use of Tropy, Archivematica, Omeka, Zotero, and all of it. GitHub, of course. Regarding national and international collaborations, it seems that so far from the few answers that I had, most of the labs, they have some certain level of collaboration, although in terms of international collaboration, it's not that dominant. So lots of labs, they still don't interact a lot in terms of international collaborations overall. And regarding the main problems that these labs present, and they answer these in proper text and somehow compile this information into categories. It seems to me that the main problem is attached somehow to precarity, because most of them are talking about how difficult it is to achieve sustainability and continuity because the funding is not something that they can rely on, or they're talking about the difficulty in terms of dealing with new technology and how the fast evolving of technologies, specifically AI, somehow clashes with their ability of keeping up with the speed of this transformation. And in a way, this brings back to the idea of precarity and somehow the impossibility of making digital history and doing digital history in the way that somehow they perceive that it's done in labs that have more infrastructure and are not in that peripheral areas. Okay, but this is just a general impression, and this somehow, I think, not completely confirm what I thought initially, because I mean the landscape is not that bad. I mean, the landscape shows that there are lots of labs, 36, I think it's a good number of labs, and I'm pretty sure that I'll find more in the following months of research. And I'm pretty sure I'll get more information about them, and you have very rich research, and people are managing with the conditions that they have to multiply. So it's an indication that from the mid-2010s on, you have multiple labs being founded and people trying to manage things creatively, as I'll bring together very soon. This is my very case, to be honest. The lab that I'm trying to build up here at my university, we started last year. So this is very new, and there's a lot of people living things similar. So it's not that bad. However, we cannot ignore that data confirm that the problems of precarity, the problems of being in the margins and having some types of difficulties in keeping up consistent funding, it's problematic. So this brings, of course, problems in terms of building a field that relies so much on infrastructures and capabilities in terms of technical management of digital tools and so on. But now I'm bringing a more theoretical and more essayistic part, so to speak, of thinking about how can we think about the possible futures of digital history in Latin America, thinking from Latin America, but to the world overall. Is there something in our own history of a region that has always dealt with types of knowledge and concepts that were developed outside of Latin America, but in more central areas that can bring us some type of inspiration? In this sense, I'm dialoguing a lot with the thinking of post-colonial thought from basically the 60s on, thinking a lot about, for example, the provocations that Chakrabarty makes about how the idea of uniformized concepts produced in Europe or in central areas somehow always bring people in the margins to the idea of being in the waiting room of history. So in the context of in development or in pre-capitalist conditions of living, and the problems of universalizing concepts that are created in very specific parts of the world in conditions, and somehow using this univocally to very different cultural spaces. So I'm dealing with the problem of Orientalism, I'm dealing with the problem of inequality and the problem of the universal and the particular. And this is a foundational problem for history in itself. If you think about all of the debates, and you know way better than me, and I think that in the German curriculum, this is way more studied than in here, but all of the debates that you have in German historiography in the 19th century about the particularity and the singularity of the historical events and how to deal with the time that passes and how to deal with historical consciousness that always put the historians in a different place than the event that it's studying. So how to deal with theory and how to manage empiricism and somehow theory. It's a way to gather the possibility of explanation. And it's very interesting because if you look, and this is, I don't know how much you're familiar with Brazilian historiography in the 19th century or the 20th century, but it's in Brazil, when Brazil got in, I'll put Brazil a little bit in the highlight here, because of course I have more familiarity with it, and I think the examples will be richer in this sense. But this is a picture, for example, of a book, História Geral do Brasil, the General History of Brazil, that is considered to be a foundational book and the first great book of Brazilian history. And this was written in the middle of the 19th century by a historian called Francisco Adolfo de Varnhagen. And he was a member of the Brazilian Institute of History and Geography. And the idea was, Brazil was a monarchy, the only monarchy here in South America. And the idea was to create somehow conditions to write a history of a new country that somehow had a very difficult past in dealing with the problems of slavery, of the relationship with the Portuguese crown, considering that the kings of Brazil, they were part of the Portuguese crown, and the idea of the need to produce a history for a new country. This is not very specific from Brazil. If you look at the place of history from the perspective of lots of states in Europe in the 19th century, you also have the idea of the need of producing a history for a new country and for a new people under modern terms. But in the case of Brazil, it's very, very direct. And you can see in this very short citation from the book that the idea was to bring Brazil into the history of humanity in general, in which that of our country will one day figure. So the idea that Brazil needs to be put into the great history of humanity. And this brings the idea that we're speaking from a marginal condition. So we need to somehow keep up, to somehow enter this book of history. And the idea of defining Brazil and thinking about for example, the tropical aspects of Brazil and the idea of producing lots of things in the fields and somehow fulfilling a place in the world global market. This all somehow, very grossly speaking, they represent intentions of somehow introducing Brazil into this idea. However, if you think about the criticism that this type of history received in Brazil in for example, in the early 20th century, it's chronologically, it's very similar to the way that the historiographical criticism in Europe emerged, for example, in the works of the Annales School in France or Collingwood, or these authors that were all criticizing this political-oriented history from the 19th century in the name of a more critical and somehow problematic, in a good sense, history that could present problems and look to the present and rethink about the social place of history in terms of narrating minorities and other groups. In Latin America, it's very interesting to think about how although there is also a historiography that emerged in the 20s and 30s that also criticized this old history from the 19th century, there's an idea of somehow thinking also about how difficult it is to deal with the heritage that comes from Europe in terms of these new ideas of history. In the sense that if the goal of history somehow is to help to explain colonial pasts and to somehow help to surpass these problems and bring these marginalized nations into a more developed form, you have to be critical with everything that regards this center of the world that once colonized us. So the idea is that, of course, it's very inspirational to look of European historiography and to think about ideas of modernity. However, it is impossible from day one to simply translate universalized ideas that come from Europe or from the US, for example, and just apply this to the situations in here. And this leads to some very creative and different ways of managing these very same words that are somehow processed and created in central spaces. So I'll give you three very quick examples from different contexts and different times throughout the 20th century that illustrate this. For example, the first book there is Raízes do Brasil, Roots of Brazil, from Sérgio Buarque de Holanda. This is a book from 1936, and this represents the apex of we call the Issaism in Brazil and the modernism in Brazil from a history perspective. And this is a book of history that somehow tries to investigate the history of the country, and it really dialogues with lots of criticism regarding this 19th century old school types of more methodological and political and narrative histories. It's more interpretative in a sense. However, the university and the first courses of history only started to exist in Brazil in the 1930s, and the postgrad programs were only created in the 1960s and 70s. So you're talking about historians that are trying to create an idea of a critical and modern historiography in a case in which they realize that they live in very different circumstances than in Europe. So they're dealing with these influences from European thought, and they're looking at interesting ideas and they're reading a lot, but they know that the situation that they live is different, firstly, because they have no universities in here in terms of producing knowledge, while they're looking at, for example, the Annales School, and they're having a more coordinated idea of the French university system and the postgrads and the process of creating doctors and programs of disciplinarization of the very discipline. However, here you have a more freestyle way of thinking about how to create a history that is modern. So you have a version that clearly has some inspiration and uses the same words and concepts that you have in Europe. However, you have a creative idea of rethinking about this from the margins, looking at the margins. So it's not the idea of being behind, but it's being different. The second example here is the book, The Seven Essays of Interpretation of the Peruvian Reality. And this is from José Carlos Mariátegui, who's a famous Marxist in Peru. And he had some experience. He went to Europe in the 1920s. He went back to Peru, and he basically wrote a book, a Marxist book, inspired by Marxist ideas, but dealing, for example, with the idea of how to deal with indigenous people, which was an element that when he was looking and talking with the Marxist circles in Europe, they basically didn't apply. It didn't exist in this sense. So the idea was not to somehow transmutate this concept from one place and central place to a peripheral place, bringing the same ideas as if they were universal, but to think about how to somehow appropriate these ideas in a creative sense and think, how can we deal with this idea that we live in a global capitalist world and we want to somehow do the revolution as they want in England, for example, or in Germany, for example, but we're in Peru and the situation is different. And we have indigenous people and we have a colonial past. And what does this mean in terms of producing knowledge in a different sense? The last example is a way more recent book from a Brazilian historian called Sidney Chalhoub, called Visões da Liberdade, so Visions of Freedom. And it's a very, very, very nice book about the basically history of enslaved people in Brazil during the times in which they were fighting for abolition, so in the late 19th century. And this is a historian that is very much and openly inspired by the New Left, for example, from Britain. So he's really inspired by Thompson and the idea of history from below and stuff like this. And so he's dealing with some type of Marxist influence to think about the conscience of the working class. But in the case, he's working with a working class that are enslaved people. So if you think about the more traditional and orthodox Marxist paradigm, not you're thinking about a working class that in the capitalist world are fighting against the elites and the bourgeois group, he's thinking about slavery. So he's thinking about a total different group in the sociological terms. He'll think about the way that they present themselves in this sense. And his questions are, can we think about the class conscience if you think about enslaved people? So again, you have a historian that is trying to somehow keep a dialogue with conceptual visions that are coming from different places than Brazil, than the 19th century Brazil. And there's this constant reflection and tension about ideas and places. How do we work with these globalized ideas and universalized ideas that were basically created in central areas if we're dealing with different spaces? As I said, this is not a Latin American specificity. This is part of somehow the very challenge of the historical consciousness, if you think about since the 19th century, the very idea of hermeneutics, for example, and thinking about the difficulties of translating and interpreting and the measurement of words that we have to think about times and past and people that are not ourselves. So these are very foundational ideas, but in a way, they represent that same words might bring new frameworks. And why am I doing all of this exercise of looking toward the past? Because I do think that this might be an indication and an idea that maybe, who knows, can Latin American digital history be more than marginalized digital history? Can these labs and these researchers that are constantly looking at their own labs and thinking, I don't have what they have there in the US, I don't have the conditions to have a very nice infrastructure in here, I don't have this. Can this don't have become just, I have a different way of thinking about this discipline. I have a different way about questioning and thinking about the very constitution of the idea of what digital history is. So it's a kind of difficult balance of thinking about the need of development, which is undeniable, but also this weight and this idea and this tradition of reinventing and somehow using terms from a periphery, thinking about them from the peripheral perspective, and not aggregating this to a negative connotation, but thinking about possibilities and pathways forward. The same way that historians in the 1930s that had no university programs could, yes, talk about being historians in modern terms, even though they had not universities. In the same way that Marxists in the past could think about social transformation, even though they could think that they were not even an industrial country. So therefore, they would not be applied for the idea of a revolution. So I'm just saying that this might bring some qualities that I will try to indicate to basically walk towards the end of this talk, that involves thinking about what can we see in the recent years in the way that digital history has been presented and produced that might indicate that we might be somehow following these pathways of reinventing traditions in a creative way, or what might we think that that no, they're just basically feeling left aside and feeling basically behind. So one thing that I would like to, for example, use an example. You have lots of works in digital history that are being written by colleagues here in Brazil and in other countries in Latin America that have lots of theoretical effort in it. So you have lots of works of people that are trying to think about the constitution of knowledge in phases of digital transformation. Of course, not only here. We know that you have lots of great historians thinking about this all over the place. However, it's particularly meaningful to me that you have, it's more common in Brazil, for example, to have historians that describe themselves as digital historians, talking more from a theoretical perspective than from a methodological perspective in terms of applying digital methods and processing large data in large scale. This might be because of the lack of infrastructure and because of the difficulty of implementing projects when you don't have the ability of, for example, building a partnership with computational science professionals, for example. This might be because the lack of infrastructures in terms of processing computers and stuff like this. But this also might be because of the tradition of reflecting about the very condition of being in the margins. So it's interesting that one has, for example, articles like this ones that I'm presenting here, just the titles of it. The second one, for example, that is thinking about AI, but also thinking about the epistemic constitution of knowledge and how to integrate and to think about indigenous ideas of time in AI models, if that is even possible. And the first one is thinking about what does it mean to have a automated systems of writing, and when we think about authorship and the idea of creativity from a historian standpoint. And most of the works in the field of digital history in the past 10 years in here bring somehow this type of theoretical reflection, which for me it's not a distinction in terms of something that differentiates it from the other types of reflections that are produced elsewhere, but somehow show that this idea of thinking, the self-reflection about the field from the margins is something noticeable. This also brings other ideas of rethinking the idea of marginality and thinking about uses of technology that somehow represent a resistance of this type of more peripheral idea that you just lack all the time. So I have here, for example, this chapter that were written in partnership by two historians that are very, very influential in the field of digital humanities overall. One of them, Jimena, Argentinian, who talks about exactly the idea of being in the epistemic margins of digital humanities. And also this book by David Nemer, a Brazilian researcher that works about the introduction of digital technologies in Brazilian favelas in the 2000s. And he basically presents ideas that somehow enact the idea of minimal computing and creative uses for technologies in places in which informality and precarity is basically the rule and the way that they live their day-to-day life. So he talks about, for example, people sharing smartphones, which is something that somehow goes against the idea that we have that smartphone is a personal gadget. No, people can share a smartphone, or people can use social media to talk about police violence, or people can rethink the idea of technology and recreate technology in ways that is different than the way that they were created. And this is something that brings the idea of looking digital history from the margins, not trying to keep that in the margins, but also thinking about possibilities and differences, and not only qualitative, better or worse in terms of people. Otherwise, people in the favelas would be just in the end of the line forever, like they're impossible for them to do what people with technology do, which is not exactly true, as we can see. Just another quick example. This is a project that we just launched, and I was leading it and with other colleagues. And this is, for example, an idea of creating a digital memorial for the COVID-19 pandemic, having a very, very strong leaning towards the people and working with collaboration with other people to build an archive from below. So we're talking about things that happened, that things that are being done everywhere. If you think about crowdsourcing and the ideas of creating collaborative knowledge and gathering records in a collaborative sense. But what I can see is that this might be, and this is a project that got the support from government and from other organizations in here. And it seems to be also, for me, an example and an indication that there's a lot of intention of somehow thinking about the uses of technologies from below somehow, and integrating people in the way that people manage technologies themselves. Our idea here was basically to collect into a digital preservation infrastructure different collections that people created during the pandemic under very precarious situations. So you have, for example, people who lived in the favelas in Rio de Janeiro that collected in an Instagram page, they documented the event in real time. And also you have, for example, one has indigenous people living in their villages with very precarious conditions that recorded in a WhatsApp app, for example, audio message talking about how they were living in this context. And the idea is, how can we manage technology to somehow aggregate these different ways of seeing technology and using technology and producing a type of digital history that's not really about the methods and about the process of data and visualization and the big, but about the small, and about the experiences that people have with technology themselves, and about how the technological transformation enacts new forms of archiving and interacting with the experience of time. And in a way, none of this eliminates the problem of precarization. So it's an unavoidable path that these actions need to be coordinated and need to be made under collaboration. It's impossible to think, and it's idealistic to think, that although we might have a glass half full idea that there's a creative path to think about digital history in different senses than in central areas, that this would eliminate the idea and the need of development. Of course, this one thing cannot somehow eliminate the other. But the idea of coordinating, collaborating, and somehow getting to know each other turns into more and more important in this sense. So the sense of mapping the labs not only has the idea of understanding from an ethnographical standpoint how people are working, but also to make it possible for people and for us to collaborate in a more complementative sense. So I would like to finish just very shortly saying that the next steps is not only about thinking and describing and theorizing about digital history from the margins, but also somehow making it possible for these different paths of digital history to somehow sit together and think about possibly a regional agenda and think about possibly a global agenda. So this is just a picture of a call that the Brazilian government launched about the process for integrating different institutions. Now, because of this work, I was able to apply for one of these projects with a group of 8 labs from different countries in Latin America to somehow try to build the first steps towards a network of digital history labs in the region. So it's a process of not only reflecting on where we are so far and somehow mapping labs and talking to people, reading different works and thinking about the tradition and the history of the production of knowledge in Latin America, but also thinking about the next steps in the idea of collaborating. So, and by the way, we have this proposition basically done. So if you hear about another possibility there in Europe that we can intercross different regions, this would be something amazing, I think, and very beneficial for everyone in terms of interacting and questioning the stability of these terms that we somehow naturalize as universal. I don't want to extend myself so far. I was planning to speak for about, 45 minutes so that we can have time to discuss and I can maybe, listen to some of your comments about what I just said. So that's basically it. I thank you again very much for the possibility of presenting to you here. For me, this type of situation is very, very conspicuous in terms of debating the globality of what we are all facing today. And that's it. Thank you so much.